In the previous video, I explained the purpose why the Bible was written, that is to make us believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Starting from this video, I'd like to share the definition of the gospel in a more profound way. In fact, there is nothing more important than the gospel. At the same time, there is nothing more corrupt than the gospel in this generation. I keep using the expression that the gospel has been corrupt or diluted. It's because Satan certainly exists, even if it's unseen to our eyes. From the beginning, Satan knew better than us what's most important. So he has been attacking the humanity because he understands very well that we, the humanity, should not receive the gospel. Therefore, he constantly tried to corrupt the gospel from the beginning. As mentioned in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Satan attacks us continuously so that we cannot see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ. When we look at Galatians chapter 1, verse 6 through 9, there are some strange verses. Radically speaking, Apostle Paul almost cursed Galatian churches in these verses. In Galatians chapter 1, verse 6 through 9, it says, "How could you desert the one who called you? How could you follow a different gospel?" I'm astonished. That's how Paul starts in the verse 6. The epistles to the Galatians, the churches of Galatia, is usually estimated to be written 20 or 25 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. Apostle Paul was writing a letter to Galatians because of what was happening at the time. How can you so quickly desert the gospel we preached to you, the gospel of the Christ, and follow different gospel? You say that this is a gospel and that is a gospel and talk about different gospels. However, is a different gospel truly the gospel? The verse 7 says, there's not such a thing as a different gospel. There's no other gospel. Why is it? Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and are trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. We don't have several kinds of gospel. A different gospel is not the true gospel. That's why the verse 8 says, "But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than the one we preach to you, let them be under God's curse." In verse 9, it also says, "As we have already said, so now I say again, if anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted, let them be under God's curse." If you preach a different gospel, you will be cursed. We see that the Galatian churches were already lost in different gospels, so basically Paul was cursing the churches in Galatians. What did he do that? Why did he do that? It's because they were following a different gospel and preaching a different gospel. The gospel that we preach to you, that's the only gospel. And if some people preach or follow a different gospel, they will be condemned. But now I can see that you're following a different gospel, you will be condemned. An apostle is daring to curse the churches, and it's a very serious situation if you think about it. Apostle Paul never compromised in regard to the gospel. He was flexible on other issues, but he never compromised when it comes to the gospel. Seeing this from a different perspective, we come to know that Satan has tried to pervert the gospel since the time of early church. It was not a long time after Jesus was crucified. Only about 20 years have passed. Now we are living in a generation 2,000 years after his crucifixion. It's not too much to say that the attempts to pervert, distort, and reduce the gospel have been even more expanded. We need to stop and look back at ourselves. Where are we now? So the gospel we believe fall into the category of the gospel Paul preached, or perhaps, just like the Galatian churches, are we deviated from the gospel thinking that we know the gospel? We need to reflect on ourselves. As you can read from 1st and 2nd Corinthians, there were so many problems in the church at Corinth. When all these issues arose, 2 Corinthians chapter 11:4 says, "For if someone comes to you and preaches Jesus other than the Jesus we preach, or if you receive a different spirit from the spirit you received, or a different gospel from the one you accepted, you put up with it easily enough. You put up with the different Jesus, a different gospel, and a different spirit so easily. How come this is happening?" The verse is asking this. The issue of a different gospel came to the fore already in the churches of Galatia and Corinth. We need to look at ourselves and see if we are falling into the same place as the Galatian and Corinthian churches. From Galatians chapter 1, 6 through 8, we can get the idea. If we understand the gospel that Paul preached, the gospel that Paul gave to the churches, if we look at that, then wouldn't we be able to understand the correct definition of the gospel? I believe believe it's a proper approach. In Romans chapter 16, 25 through 27, the gospel is described this way. Now to him who is able to establish you in accordance with my gospel, the message I proclaim about Jesus Christ, in keeping with the revelation of the mystery hidden for long ages past, but now revealed and made known. It says that gospel has been hidden since the world began, and now it's revealed. Now revealed and made known through the prophetic writings by the command of the eternal God. The gospel has been revealed through the prophetic writings, but can be known through the mysterious revelation. This is revealed now. That's what Paul says here. And at the same time, in Romans chapter 1, verse 1 through 4, it also says that the hidden gospel is now revealed and can be known through the mysterious revelation. And Romans chapter 1, 1 through 4 draws a definition of the gospel, especially in verse 2. The gospel he promised beforehand through his prophets and the Holy Scriptures regarding his Son. In other words, the gospel is regarding his Son. That is to say, the gospel is about Jesus, who is the Son of God. Let's develop this further, just a little bit. Apostle Paul, right after his repentance, he preached the gospel from the beginning. In Acts chapter 9, Apostle Paul repented on his journey to Damascus. In verse 20 through 22, we can see one message Apostle Paul preached. Especially in verse 22, Saul grew more and more powerful and proved that Jesus is the Christ. He testified that right after his repentance on his way to Damascus. In Acts chapter 17, we can find a similar verse. Years have passed from Acts 9 to Acts 17. There are different opinions regarding this among theologians, but about 15 or 20 years have passed. After 15 or 20 years later, Apostle Paul constantly preached the same message. He reasoned from the scriptures and preached one message. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I'm proclaiming to you is the Christ, he said. This is from Acts chapter 17, 2 through 3. In Acts chapter 18, 5, it says, when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. The message of Apostle Paul was the message regarding his Son. And more specifically, it was the message about Jesus is the Christ. This is a gospel that Apostle Paul preached. So next video, we're going to go through the message of other apostles other than Apostle Paul, and also the message of early church members, and examining the definition of the gospel by doing so.